Hello, everybody. Happy Sunday. Greetings from Ohlone Territory, San Francisco Bay Area, United States of America. My name is Bia Labachi, and I have a PhD in anthropology, and I am the executive director of the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines. I'm proud to say that Chacruna is a golden sponsor of this conference, and just want to praise the organizers for a truly high quality excellence level conference. The conference calls itself interdisciplinary in the title, and I think it really honors that title. I'm happy to see a panel entirely with anthropologists and social science in the midst of a more scientific and combination of presentations. So it's good to have our discipline represented. And yeah, we're here to talk about the globalization of ayahuasca, a topic that is dear to our hearts, our minds, our souls. And as my friend, dear mentor, colleague, and part of our team, Glenn Shefford, once wrote in a book, in a preface of one of our books, the genie is out of the bottle. Whether we want it or not, ayahuasca has spread beyond the Amazon all over the planet. So what are our reflections about ethical, political, and economical implications of the globalization of ayahuasca? And when I ask this question, I'm not worried only as us, as academics, intellectuals, social scientists, but as parts of this so-called psychedelic community. What are our responsibilities and what is our role towards this globalization? What are we doing and how is this affecting indigenous people? And to bring to the forefront an issue that is central to the Chacruna Institute and also dear to us, is that idea of reciprocity. Are we giving back and how? And are we making sure that this globalization is sailing the best way it could? So I'm so happy to have here three real researchers, with Daniela on this whole special level of being a kind of mentor to many of us and, decades of field work in the Amazon, but also David and Olivia with their solid track record of field work. So it's not just because the life of an anthropologist is kind of hard because everybody has opinions of everything, but that's not the same as doing research and field work. And here we have people that have done actual research and field work, that have been down in the ground, and also doing research is not just turning on a microphone and asking a bunch of questions. It's more complicated and sophisticated than that. So I'm happy to hear all of these folks and learn with them, share with them. Daniela has focused more on Madre de Dios, and David and Olivia more in the region of Tarapoto. They can tell more. That's my intro. Thanks again for the organizers. Congrats for an amazing gathering. Thanks for you all to be on the Sunday, helping us create these conversations that are complicated because so many of us like to drink ayahuasca, but it's getting harder and harder and muddier to just be quiet. And what are we saying? What are we doing? How can we contribute? So with that, it's my introduction. I'm gonna jump all the formalities about titles and who they are. You can read in the bios in the site. Daniela, welcome.
Hello.
Can you begin by giving us an overview of the context of the globalization of ayahuasca from an indigenous and on-the-ground perspective in Peru to the international scale? And I'll give you about 8 to 10 minutes and I'll flag you around towards the end, okay?
Okay, please do. Thanks for that question, Bia, and how nice it is to be here at the ICPR conference with David and Olivia as well, and all of the attendees. So the globalization, internationalization, and diaspora of ayahuasca, the uses and practices, as Bia has said, the genie's out of the bottle, but they are continually on the rise. And this is as obvious to us as it is to many indigenous peoples. So, well, it's indisputable now, of course, that ayahuasca has moved from the Amazonian forest to the global stage, and it has undoubtedly been holding its place very well in the spotlight. So I guess what I'll do is I will briefly walk you through how it was once a very localized practice and how it now basks in a very lucrative growing tourism market and can itself be considered in a process of commodification, a process that has sparked new enterprises and expertise to the extent that it is an industry. There's a wide range of existing and potential forms of ayahuasca-related businesses that comprise the ayahuasca entrepreneurial ecosystem and contribute toward the making of such an industry. And such entrepreneurship is clearly linked to the global use and interest in ayahuasca. So my brief run through of how the ayahuasca industry has developed in only a few decades from an obscure practice into a cosmopolitan capitalist endeavor will focus on Tambopata, which is in Madre de Dios, Peru, which is a biodiversity hotspot, and it's comprised of the Tambopata National Reserve and the Bawaja-Soneni National Park, and these together form a mega corridor together with Bolivia and Peru and protected areas. So I'll pace from the 1980s to the present very briefly. Were many transformations that have taken place locally over time, mostly the emergence of international tourism, local entrepreneurship, and the international popularity of ayahuasca, alongside local perceptions of ayahuasca use and political changes in Peru affecting both migration and tourism. So just to start, ayahuasca was in this area was really a rarity. There were some ayahuasqueros, but then their histories were also diverse, but they were very few. And a lot of them learned from people outside of the region. And even the ones who were in town, you know, I've interviewed their children who used to kind of help facilitate ceremonies and so on. And they said that they never saw gringos. They said they saw a lot of people that came from, you know, people traveled from Peru and maybe even Brazil to see them, but never gringos. And by that, I mean Westerners. I assume everyone knows what that means. And it really wasn't until the early 80s that a gringo actually went to drink in the Tamaulipas area. And even then, you know, he had a very difficult time finding someone. And coincidentally, when he finally went to see the person he could drink with, he bumped into an Aceja who was also looking for the same ayahuasquero, and they went together and had that shared experience. And I mention this because if you go to the top ecotourist lodge run in an Aceja community called Infierno, you go on the tour, they will tell you that ayahuasca use is an ancient tradition that was taught from shaman to son and so on and so forth. And of course, the first Aceja to drink was actually on that particular day. So it maintained a lot of secrecy, mostly due to Christianity and sort of conservatism. And this really began to change when there was a local grassroots movement, a health movement, which was inspired by the Shipibos, but happened among other indigenous groups in Tambopata. And that was called Ametra 2001, and that stands for Aplicación de Medicina Tradicional. And although they didn't really focus on ayahuasca, they promoted shamanism in general. And when they invited some Shipibo shamans to join them, those shamans trained people as ayahuasqueros. And I saw Aceja, Huachipaira, Maracaire, almost all the indigenous groups be trained in that sort of those skills and arts, but they were still quite novice at it. They were didn't become known as like great healers. They were beginning that path. So at this exact time, you get these incredible political changes in Peru, because up until then, you know, we had Sendero Luminoso, which was the Maoist terrorist group, which created a lot of problems for everyone. And the Emeretea, which, you know, when Fujimori was elected, early Fujimori, you know, that all pretty much came to an end, and there was all this investment, and you get what is the migration of middle class from Lima into a region where they just hadn't really wandered. I mean, a migration where people go to live, raise their kids, start small businesses, and so on and so forth. And this was very different from the kinds of migrations that came from the Andes, which was sort of, you know, you know, that was sort of poverty alleviation migration, where people came and they did not like the forest and they resented living there. And these people came and they thought it was the most beautiful place and they wanted to use the natural products and so on and so forth. So there's that kind of a mindset between the grassroots movement and this sort of middle class limeño that arrives. And the people who were drinking and practicing ayahuasca started very small local businesses. Now, these were owned by people in Tabapata, and I'm talking about somebody just putting a wooden plaque that says open for ceremony or something like that. And these people became very successful at that. At the same time, the conservation investments in the area were enormous. A big rise of the very large conservation organizations came down there. And with that, there is the investment in ecotourism, because ecotourism was seen as the way to get indigenous people to stop killing animals, which really bothered them. So they, you know, through the ecotourism, some of them were set up to look like joint ventures, and maybe one actually is, but these ecotourist lodges then realized that, you know, aligned with the tourist boom, started having ayahuasca ceremonies, in which case a lot of new ayahuasqueros appeared, usually young people who maybe had only drunk once or twice, so on and so forth. I think that this is well known, the proliferation of shamans. I don't think I have to kind of go through that. That's something that responds to demand. So then there is...
Daniela?
Yeah.
Heads up, 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Oh, okay. Well, that really flew by. I'm really sorry about that. So let me just drop all of that and tell you that I think that, you know, there's different ideas about globalization. And, you know, one of them is this kind of boundary breaking. We're no longer discrete nations. It's very utopian. Everyone's interconnected. And there's a whole part of ayahuasca that fits into that beautifully. I mean, using ayahuasca and so on and so forth is part of that. But there is also the other theories of globalization, and they go hand in hand, which is that, you know, it is a global capitalist system. Goods and practices move from the global south to the global north, and we are consuming and we are extracting and we are not returning and giving back. So I think, having missed out on part of my question, I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Daniela. And I also want to share with you guys here in the chat this document that Chacruna published, The Commodification of Ayahuasca, How Can We Do Better? Daniela played an important role in the creation of this document, alongside with our guidelines for raising awareness around sexual abuse, which are more like impact-oriented actions towards this same theoretical conversation. So now I'm going to pass to another dear colleague, and want to remind everybody to put their questions in questions and answers. At 1 o'clock, we're going to have a stop for questions and answers. David, in light of this phenomenon of ayahuasca internationalization, can you speak to the context of a health clinic like Takiwazi and its role in the internationalization of ayahuasca shamanism? We know that Takiwazi played an important role there, and you have a solid field work there. Although I do want to thank David, because his original panel proposal was about another topic. And I also want to address a comment by Eduardo Schemberg that are lacking indigenous people in this panel, which is absolutely fair critique, and clarified that the panels were created just with the abstracts that were already presented, and they were changed and adapted and modified due to COVID. So the whole conference migrated online, and a lot of changes have had to be done. And new presenters were not invited at this point. And I think a lot, it was a big challenge to juggle everything around. And I really want to thank David for his patience with having his topic switched around and the efforts of the organizers in readapting for online and all the stress that caused to them. David, 10 minutes.
Thank you, Bia, and thank you for your question. And thanks to the ICPR for the invitation to this final panel of this great conference. Well, I'm a French social anthropologist working on the globalization of psychedelic substances and relations between hallucinations and culture. And I started to conduct anthropologic survey about 10 years ago now in the upper Peruvian Amazon. I dedicated my first anthropological survey on Takiwasi, that drug addiction treatment clinic that you just talked about, which has been founded by a French doctor in medicine 30 years ago. The project was initially inspired by psychedelic therapies. The idea was to create an addiction treatment that would articulate the practices of Peruvian mestizo shamanism, such as the ritual use of ayahuasca with psychotherapy and biomedicine. As this panel is about globalization of ayahuasca, it's really important to say that this institution has played a key role in this dynamic. Takiwasi has been indeed one of the first institutions to formalize very specific devices for international clients going to the Amazon in order to drink ayahuasca. So in order to meet the growing demand of shamanic tourists, Takiwasi organized in the 90s 2-week seminars involving practices of the Peruvian mestizo shamanism as ayahuasca ritual, purged ritual, diets, coupled with preliminary lectures and integration sessions via group talks and interviews. Numerous Peruvian mestizo and native healers of the region have learned how to work with international clients working at Takiwasi, and many of them have been inspired by Takiwasi and found their own reception center for international clientele. The most famous example of this is probably Guillermo Arevalo, the Shipibo healer, who founded his own center near Iquitos with the help of a former patient of Takiwasi, and later became world famous. During my investigation, I made comparative fieldwork to better understand both the sources of inspiration of the practices proposed by Takiwasi, indigenous and mestizo lamista shamanism, and to understand to what extent Takiwasi inspired the practices of other centers in the region. So doing so, my aim was to grasp the dynamics of transformation of the practices and discourses surrounding the use of ayahuasca and the dynamic of globalization of Peruvian shamanism. So it was quite striking to observe during that survey that there was a strong symbolic and commercial competition between these different centers for foreign customers. While mestizo and indigenous healers denounced the incompetence of the gringo healers, the latter denounced the fact that indigenous often have difficulty respecting the basic ethical rules that should surround therapeutic practices, denouncing, for instance, acts of black magic or sexual abuses. During the survey, I was also struck by the differences in the participants' experience during ayahuasca ritual offered by these different institutions. For instance, in Takiwasi, sequences of demonic possession were frequently occurring during ayahuasca rituals, which was absent in the other places where I conducted survey. Ethnographic observations suggested in this respect that cultural and symbolic elements as cosmological and etiological theories, as well as the features of the ritual devices specific to these institutions, strongly influenced the formal characteristic of the psychedelic experience. Over time, Takiwasi has indeed gradually based his etiological theory on infestation, a concept derived from Catholic demonology that refers to a minor form of demonic possession, which is taught in Takiwasi as the cause of pathologies such as addiction. The importance given to this cultural pattern seemed to explain the frequency of possession phenomena that frequently occur during rituals. This was not such a great discovery in itself, since we know well that hallucinogenic experience is highly dependent on extra pharmacological factors such as expectation, preparation, intention, as well as physical and social environments. Anthropologists have, by the way, long observed homogeneity in the features of the hallucinatory experience within the same cultures, and have been led to defend consequently a culturalist approach to psychedelic experience. But the vectors by which the features of psychedelic experience are structured by social factors have been so far little explored. I have therefore concentrated my work on trying to understand the vectors through which social, discursive, and ritual devices shape not only the relationship to the psychedelic experience, but also its very phenomenological content. For those interested, I have recently published an article that models this dynamic, which I have proposed to call socialization of hallucinations, proposing quantitative factors such as the education of attention, the categorization of perceptions, and the shaping of emotions and expectation. When one dialogue with the international clients of these practices, it seems that this dynamic was at the heart of the therapeutic effectiveness of ayahuasca. The integration by the participants of the local cosmology leads in fact to identity reconfigurations that transform the relationship of participants to one's biography, symptoms, and daily behaviors. Since this panel addresses ethical issues of the globalization of ayahuasca, it's important to say that the dynamic of socialization of hallucinations highlight also the state of high suggestibility in which psychedelic substances place users. If this is probably one of the underpinnings of the therapeutic efficacy of ayahuasca, it also raises serious ethical questions in the current context of globalization of the use of these substances. From the political perspective, it's interesting to note that Takiwasi had been the object of strong critiques from the French government and French institutions fighting cultish abuses. In front of the increasing rise of shamanic tourism, French public authorities feared that ayahuasca could be used as a tool for mental manipulation made by cultish groups. The very fast integration of the institution's cosmology through the participation to the ayahuasca rituals has been seen by public authorities as a dangerous form of brainwashing. These accusations made by the government agencies had important repercussions, such as a trial in France against Takiwasi, which eventually led to the prohibition of ayahuasca in the country and the lasting public stigmatization of these practices. These events have also influenced public policies regarding ayahuasca in other European countries, such as Belgium. So it's quite striking to see that the socialization of hallucinations dynamics seems to be at the origin of both some therapeutic effects of the use of psychedelics and serious ethical concerns from public authorities regarding these practices. So beyond the particular case of Takiwasi, this raises the ethical implications of one of the striking features of psychedelic-induced experiences, their ability to increase truth to cultural propositions and reverence to the holders of this proposition. In addition to producing perception whose phenomenological content is strongly influenced by culture, psychedelic substances as ayahuasca also have another remarkable property. Many observers have noted the ability of psychedelics to induce noetic feelings, attributing strong self-relevance to the experience. The psychedelics experience is indeed frequently marked by the striking subjective feeling of gaining unmediated knowledge. Information is usually received and believed as a revelation without a subjective need of external validation or evidence. Even if, as illustrated by the dynamic of socialization of hallucinations, psychedelic experiences are always socially mediated. However, they are frequently felt as unmediated, as a direct revelation. I feel that this contradiction bears really important ethical issues. As psychedelics are able to produce perceptions whose phenomenological content is strongly influenced by culture, discourses, and social interactions, this noetic property may indeed enhance the significance and attribution of reality of cultural worldviews. Yeah, I know.
Okay.
So this noetic property may indeed enhance the significance and attribution of reality to cultural worldviews as metaphysical, ontological, or supernatural claims. So these true properties make ayahuasca a powerful vector of cultural transmission and affiliation to social group. While this mechanism may drive therapeutic benefits, the ability of ayahuasca to induce feeling of reverence and revelation might lead to problematic effects and raise obvious ethical questions. These properties make indeed psychedelics potential dangerous tools if put into the wrong hands. This appears as a future major and growing issue, as a renewed interest for these substances is generally observed in the global north through the rise of shamanic tourism and the renaissance of psychedelic science and clinical studies. So, well, I will have to stop here, but for those who are interested, we are preparing with some colleagues a special issue of the Transcultural Psychiatry Journal, which will be published next year, and which elaborate on these ethical issues. In an article to be published in this special issue, we have with Chris Timmerman and Rosalind Watts from the Center for Psychedelic Research of Imperial College London, put these questions into perspective and made proposals to deal with these ethical aspects within the framework of the clinical use of psychedelics. Thank you.
Very well, thank you. Kept perfect time of your time. I'm going to pass the word to Olivia now. Olivia, continue on this topic. How are concepts such as integration therapy and ethical guidelines for practitioners complicated by internationalization of ayahuasca, not only across the world, but across professions and different cultural milieus, or however you say that word? You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, it's
Yes.
just finding the button. All right, so thank you, Bia, for this question, and I'm very happy to be on this panel with all of you. Get started quickly. So I consider the ethical complexities that accompany the convergence of what I call psi disciplines and vegetalismo, which is a form of mestizo shamanism that both David and Danielle have spoken about. The lack of common worldviews that distinguish Andean Amazonian shamanism from Western psi practitioners, clientele, and retreat center business models produces confusing intercultural encounters in the domain of patient care and safety. I track where disparate ethical configurations lead Westerners to privilege their own disease etiologies over that of the so-called other, despite the desire to be etiologically inclusive. One of my central arguments is that although the power dynamic between vegetalismo and Western epistemologies of healing remains asymmetrical, Westerners' experiences of illness, suffering, and healing are fundamentally altered when they engage with Andean Amazonian cosmology. And this alteration in perception is critical for the healing process. In line with what David has referred to as the socialization of hallucinations, this might be called a socialization of healing experiences, which is a phenomenon that anthropologists often refer to. And I take specific attention to concerns about ethics and care when multiple epistemologies are brought together, particularly when such stark asymmetries privilege Western epistemologies of healing and illness, all the while attempting to accommodate Amazonian understandings of illness, wellness, and the process of healing. The psychoactive effects of ayahuasca are often referred to as psychedelic and are considered to be beneficial for a variety of mental health issues, with most published studies focused on well-being, depression, and PTSD. There has been an increase in the number of practitioners and researchers who consider psychotherapeutic techniques to be an important adjunct to ayahuasca shamanism for so-called integration or integration therapy. Ayahuasca ceremonies can be particularly life-changing events, as can other traditional Amazonian healing processes. Integration therapy is supposed to help guide people through the challenges of integrating their psychedelic experiences and can be important for both harm reduction and for benefit maximization. Integration may involve a number of side disciplines, though what actually constitutes integration is hotly debated. And despite its vague definition, many retreat centers are now prioritizing integration as part of the retreat process, some keeping trained mental health professionals on staff. I don't doubt that there are nodes of commensurability between Western bioethics and what I'll provisionally call vegetalista ethics. However, recognizing the incommensurabilities is important for thinking about best practices and what it means to be an ethical practitioner. The ethical frameworks that are brought to the table in these discussions have underlying sociocultural assumptions. Vegetalismo, for example, is guided by a pervasive Andean Amazonian ethic of reciprocity, as Bia referred to in her introduction. This reciprocity extends to both human and other than human worlds, where relationships are intertwined and the question of who is healing or what is causing harm is often considered to concern more than just an individual, if indeed an individual person, if indeed a person is even involved. I will provisionally refer to this form of relationality based on reciprocity as vegetalista ethics, although I cannot pretend to label vegetalismo or ayahuasca shamanism as one cohesive and consistent practice. I find creating this label useful as an umbrella term that refers to a non-codified, diverse, and constantly evolving practice. On the other hand, side disciplines hold to a specific codified ethics that delineate the therapist's responsibilities and the appropriate protocol for handling clients. As Robin Rod observes in his account of Pieroa shamanic ethics, there's no canonical shamanic text. Instead, shamans must develop their own ethical sensibilities through ongoing analysis of myths, visions, and social life. These three factors, myth, vision, and social life, are constantly changing in the Peruvian Amazon and certainly take different shape once exported to other parts of the globe. In the global context, discussions of ayahuasca-assisted therapies are subsumed within the larger theme of psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, which is edging its way to become an established professional field, replete with its own specific licensing programs, health insurance schemes, professional guilds, and code of ethics. All of these features of psychedelic medicine are still in their nascent stages, and although there are some initiatives like the North Star Guide based in the US that aims to hold psychedelic medicine stakeholders accountable to study the traditions, these measures do nothing to minimize the grip that the tech, health insurance, and pharmaceutical industries will have on directing how people think about psychedelic use and which practitioners are considered safe or legitimate. The ethics of integrating disparate epistemologies raises important questions about post-colonial power dynamics that bear upon indigenous forms of knowledge and practice, particularly the asymmetry of the way that knowledge claims are made. The implications here are very corporeal. For example, what is a cure, what constitutes a cure, should a cure be the ultimate goal, and also who is the practitioner, the human, the plant spirits, or the clients themselves. Integration therapy, best practices, and client safety are continuously discussed in books, scholarly papers, conferences, symposia, and among practitioner organizations. With the globalization of ayahuasca shamanism, many layers of sociocultural differences become entangled in these conversations, and the larger ethical question of how local mestizo and indigenous communities are given due respect looms large. Entrenched integration therapists who I speak to are often at a loss for how this can play out in clinical and non-clinical spaces in a way that, as one therapist phrased it, does not push aside the spiritual aspect of the practice. And she says, quote, "There's this ancient traditional practice that's been around for millennia, or so I believe, with the plants that's reaching the world, a new frontier. And how do we best need it and respect it and use it to best effect and develop frameworks in our own unique mindsets that can adapt it without losing the quality in the spirit, literally the spirit," end quote. Most psychotherapists recognize the limits of their profession when entering the world of Amazonian shamanism. Still, the historical oppression of indigenous healing practices weighs on present-day collaborations between Psy practitioners and local shamans. When considering ethical arrangements, it is necessary to acknowledge the role of Western medicine in colonial and post-colonial projects and the implications of systematically developing Psy-informed therapeutic regimes that improve upon local methods of healing or assume a best practices protocol. Vegetabilista practices in Peru have always been eclectic, having been born from constant adaptations to colonial and post-colonial influences from Europeans, descendants of African slaves, and interethnic dialogue between indigenous groups. The integration of Psy disciplines with local healing practices is not a break from tradition, but rather a continuation of this legacy, as long as the spirit of local shamanic practices are not pushed to the background to be considered as local beliefs only of interest to anthropologists. In addition to taking seriously Andean Amazonian perspectives, maintaining the spirit requires acknowledging the ways in which local healing practitioners insinuate the political relations between practitioners, communities, retreat center owners, and larger political bodies. This begs us to question how the psychologization of ayahuasca, and in turn the psychologization and codification of the Vegetabilista ethics, affect social and political movements for solidarity or the cultural thriving of marginalized communities. While the concept of a Vegetabilista ethics is at best vague, what is certain is that ethical assumptions from Psy disciplines are being layered onto the social context of ayahuasca practices, both in the Peruvian Amazon and abroad. While psychedelic practitioners initiatives ask people to educate themselves about the traditions in which psychedelic use was embedded, this is no more than a suggestion, bordering on virtue signaling that, yes, I can point out on the map and pronounce that indigenous word. However, the reverse is not true. There's little virtue to be won by the Peruvian shaman who learns about Western practices and pledges to respect the values and beliefs of Psy disciplines. Rather, there's an increasing social imperative that if a person is going to administer psychedelic substances, they should be acquainted with the new best practices and aftercare promulgated by organizations in North America and Europe. Ayahuasca shamans are expected to accommodate Western ideals of ethics, but can Western Psy disciplines accommodate Vegetabilista ethics? For now, what we can observe is the refraction of local ontologies through the lens of globalized Psy disciplines and discourses. Mainstream accounts focus almost exclusively on the psychedelic aspect of ayahuasca shamanism, with advice and services to mitigate potential traumatic effects of challenging mind-altering experiences, and note the focus on the individual mind delimited by time-specific experience. Yet the integration of Vegetabilista ethics is not the bridging of completely incommensurate ideologies. After all, most Vegetabilistas are urban dwellers in a deeply Catholic society. There's a natural ethics of caring among vegetabilista practitioners that is not imposed upon by a protocol of bureaucratically structured medical ethics. What many would call authentic healers are those who care deeply about their clientele, adhere to an ethic of do no harm, and encourage others to follow the path of love. Nevertheless, these same healers are often caught in sorcery-laden conflict with neighbors or rival shamans, stresses that are intensified by the growing number of people seeking treatments for serious illnesses and all the networks of relationships that weave humans and other than humans together in strange intercultural and interdimensional spaces. And I think I've gone 1 minute over, so I'll stop there.
You got exactly perfect. That was amazing. All right. I just want to take the minute, sorry, I'm going to take the liberty, I'm the moderator. I want to send much love to all my Brazilian friends that are in the chat. Muito amor, que alegria, axé, beijos da Califórnia. I want to congratulate Open for having a wide program of scholarships for countries, underprivileged countries, and I want to thank Open Society Foundations for giving this scholarship to this conference and commend both Open Society and the Open Foundation for this scholarship program. So we're coming to the end of our panel, and I also see some dear friends and researchers, experts. I want to tell the panelists, if you want to make questions to each other, think about it. We can also put that in the mix and I can give you the word. For now, we're going to start to take some questions from the public. So everybody can come and put your questions on the Q&A button. I'm going to start with an easy one for Olivia. That's a kind of question that like the regular psychedelic lover has. So an anonymous person is asking, what is integration in ayahuasca indigenous communities?
So a lot of people would answer this question that in indigenous communities, the concept of integration is not a codified, spoken about concept. It's kind of embedded in the sociocultural milieu of the society. So there's everything about the use of these of ayahuasca or any other plant is contextualized within that society. You're initiated or participate in an experience with someone who you probably know, or you're accompanied by people that you do know, and it's not so far outside of your personal or cultural experiences to undergo these this experience. I don't want to belabor this too long, but
it's fine.
The idea the idea is that it's not such a large like individual and also cultural break to have these experiences, which are again in ayahuasca ceremony, someone may experience many different things, and to have that normalized by the people around you, normalized by the wider social context, and then also by your closest people in your life, like your family, friends, you know, extended social network, goes a long way in helping integrate these experiences. Whereas in you know, North America or other parts of the world, it's tends to be pathologized or in other ways not normalized.
Yeah, I also want to refer to a panel that happened before in this conference where Luis Fernando Toffoli gave a lecture talking about this. He has a paper in our upcoming book talking about the concept of integration. I want to remind everybody that all the recordings are available and encourage you. If you have missed talks, you can watch them later. And talking about Toffoli, I'll pick a question from him and I'll direct that one to Daniela. Bia recently gave an interview in Portuguese about sexual abuse in the world of ritual use of ayahuasca in Brazil. How the panelists, I'm asking you, would discuss how global problems linked to prejudice, such as sexism, homophobia, racism, etc., interact with ayahuasca as it becomes increasingly global?
Thank you. Okay, so I don't know if I really fully understand the question, because he's asking interact with ayahuasca, meaning the ayahuasca experience, or with
Well, he's saying that as ayahuasca goes global, how does it combine with having stuff as sexism, homophobia, racism?
Yeah, okay. Well, I'd have to say that the first thing we have to accept is that it happens in multiple directions. It's not just a one direction. It's not just let's say, indigenous people's attitudes, you know, that one could call sexist or homophobic or racist, but also the tourists' attitudes toward that. And it's, I mean, as we've seen with, you know, these are complicated subjects, but I think, you know, we've seen like the work that Chacruna has done on sexual abuse, and we know that there are expectations that people have on both sides. When people meet in any encounter, maybe those two individuals have never met before, but their histories have, their expectations have, their cultures have. So in that sense, these are very loaded encounters. So globalization is really just a recipe for things going really well or going really poorly. So it's hard to, you know, for me to answer that specifically. I mean, I don't know if you consider that sufficient, Bia.
Or maybe you can say one line about your amazing work in the sexual abuse guidelines and explain a bit.
Sure. Yeah. Well, with the guidelines, Chacruna has actually written the guidelines, and I've helped with that. But some of it is based on some of the past research I've done. And I think that some of the stuff that is a little bit contentious about my writing is that I haven't placed it solely on the lap of the practitioner, because I try to come at this from multiple angles, from the tourists' expectations and behaviors, and as well as indigenous people's practices and behaviors, and sort of map out a whole range of scenarios where things have gone wrong, can go wrong, try to understand it, even talking about things like transference and countertransference. So I would just say that this is complex. I mean, I'm looking at the question, even with like homophobia. I mean, that I've seen that in both directions. I've seen all of these things happen in multiple directions. So it's really difficult to answer it singularly.
Yeah, well, this panel is aimed to give an overview, and we're posting some links on the chat, and feel free to reach out to us in the Chacruna Institute, and we can share our papers and books. You know, if it's not used commercially, we can share for free. There's lots of material, so it's aimed to giving an overview. And I'm gonna pass the ball to David from a question from your Tocayo, so Xará. David, I don't know how to say his last name. What is your opinion on the idea of negative spiritual forces in ayahuasca usage and vegetalismo more generally, as these practices clash with Western liberal democracies? Do you think attention to the dark side is something that ought to be sanitized or treated as a psychological aberration?
Well, absolutely not. Like I'm an anthropologist, so I'm interested in the different cultural setting and backgrounds that can surround this kind of practices. So I don't know, I'm far away from the idea like in the West, like Westerners would have like to cleanse the local indigenous practices. But the fact is that, as the talk of Olivia underlined, there is a clash of ethics. Like it's true that like the regular ethic of the mestizo shamanism include the use of let's say dark forces, sorcery, black magic. It can be okay to do so. You know, you protect your own people and you do black magic to your enemies, and it's quite okay. But this kind of thing like clash in a really obvious way with the psychotherapeutical ethics and the basic ethic that surround usually therapeutic practices. I feel that Olivia, in a way, like in our talk, like showed it that we'll have to manage this in a way, but yeah, of course, it will be like super colonial to think that we will have to cleanse, the local indigenous practices from their dark side. I feel, at least.
Yeah, and also that those practices, they work and they have a logic. So it's also, researchers have noted how witchcraft is a kind of social control as well, like helps, if somebody's getting too rich, others get jealous and comment and make accusations. It's part of a larger system that you can't just clean out. And, it's part of societies that don't have a centralized state that controls things. And, relations are organized in different ways with kinship, and there's also more writing about it. We're coming towards the end. We have just a few minutes left. I'm sorry that not all the questions will be taken. I want to give the word to Isabel. Is it possible to create a white paper or guidance, or does one exist already that provides practical suggestions of ways in which researchers can respectfully and in spirit of reciprocity approach and engage with indigenous communities they engage with? For example, what does reciprocity really means? How do we engage with the community council to define what Western culture might be able to contribute to the benefit of the community so they can get some benefit from their generous sharing of traditional wisdom? I'm gonna take the liberty to refer people to we have created one document called Bringing Indigenous People to Psychedelic Conferences. That was a modest attempt. And also, I want to refer people to another panel that happened on this conference with my colleague Emilia Sanabria, discussing reciprocity and coloniality. So some scientific researchers might think it's, they're doing a great benefit to science and to bridging tradition and wisdom and indigenous people with neuroscience and contemporary psychedelic science, and like bring the lab and to the field and to indigenous people. But the anthropologist's first question is, what is there for the indigenous person in that? And how do you build reciprocal relationships? How do you create research that is community-based? Is this a need of the community? Are they asking for this? Do they need this? Do they appreciate it? Is this built collectively? So the way you build your research also helps answering that question. But I want to just give opportunity to any of the researchers that want to comment about how can psychedelic science be reciprocal to indigenous people, also considering a big controversy that exists today in the United States about the decolonization movement and the Native Americans that are expressed wish to leave peyote out of their resolution. Anybody want to comment on any of these topics? Perhaps I'll defer to our, not elder, but more wise presenter. Daniela, do you want to say something? We just have a few minutes.
Okay, I think I'm reading the question as, how do you approach a community to find out what you could really do that has value? And I would say that I think a lot of people feel this needs to be pre-thought. And in some ways, the most important thing you can do is to take time and to go and to listen, because people will tell you what they want. And if you go there with ideas, you might often be deaf to them. So I would say that true reciprocity comes from giving something a lot of time and listening.
Move at the speed of trust, build long existing relationships, listen, be patient. That's the basic step. Anthropology 101 from the anthropologist panel in the global mainstream psychedelic science. Please keep on inviting anthropologists. Let's try to bring more indigenous people. Big bravo to Joost and all his teams. Also, to end, Olivia, Daniela, and David, how can people reach you? Are you on social media? Do you accept questions? How can you be reached quickly?
Well, as everybody, I'm on Facebook, Twitter, like I've got a web page and anything, Academia, ResearchGate. So yeah, of course, any question is welcome. So,
Olivia?
Likewise, I'm on social media. I'm unmuted. Not super active, but I do exist on the internet in social media space. And I think my email is listed somewhere in the conference agenda.
Same here, social media. You can find me on the internet, and I'm also on the Chacruna board, so you can look me up there too.
Okay, everybody, if you want to support our work at the Chacruna Institute, please join our membership program. And thank you very much. Erwin.
Thank you, Bia. Thank you for the amazing panel. Thank you, Olivia, David, Daniela. Please don't leave the stream yet, because we are going to post a link to the other room and where Joost will be soon ending the conference. So Cameron should be posting a Zoom link right there. So it might still continue for a minute or two or three at the other room before Joost starts, but please all join the room, and so that we can all together finish this really beautiful conference. And thanks again all for this panel. It was really great to be here, and I really appreciate all of your work. So thank you very much, and see you all in the other room.
Thank you.
Thank you.